Welcome to Starving for Darkness, a podcast about the power of natural darkness for all living things. I'm your host, Jane Slade, an expert in the healing benefits of the night. We are living in an age of digital overload and runaway light pollution. Right now, over 80% of humanity can no longer see the stars. Yet natural darkness may be the perfect antidote to rescue ourselves from the drawbacks of modern life. The night is a place of untapped human potential. Hello, Tim. Thank you so much for joining me on Starving for Darkness. We're in the studio today with Tim Brothers. I am Jane Slade. I'm the host of Starving for Darkness and an advocate for wildlife and the need for darkness for all living things, as well as the fact that I believe darkness is truly a source of untapped human potential. And so we're in the studio today with Tim Brothers, and I am so excited to have you here, Tim. Thank you so much.
I'm so excited to be here. This is really fun.
Yeah, excellent. So I took a look at your bio, and Tim is the observatory manager at MIT's Wallace Astrophysical Observatory, where you teach about how to observe the night sky with robotic telescopes. Definitely very interesting. You also co-founded the Massachusetts Dark Sky International chapter, where you focus on lighting policy for communities in the area. Thank you for that. Tim, you were recently awarded a minor planet designation, which is Asteroid 28992 Tim Brothers. Great name. And you focus on asteroid detection. That's amazing. And you also have a wife and kids and also some chickens in a rural homestead where you can still see the Milky Way. I'm so excited to get to dig in. I wanted to start, actually, do you have any impactful memories that happened in the dark that really transformed your relationship with darkness?
I have quite a few because I've spent an awful
awesome.
lot of my time under the night sky. But I would say, I guess I could say maybe one thing and then sort of lead off on the opposite end of it, which is after college, my first job was working for MIT Lincoln Lab doing defense work. And part of that work was they sent me out to the middle of nowhere of New Mexico on White Sands Missile Range, which is the sort of somewhat secretive base in the middle of nowhere. It's probably about the size of Rhode Island, and it's pitch black. It's the darkest place I've ever been in my life. And so part of my job was we were a team assigned to detect hazardous asteroids and comets heading towards the planet, and we discovered thousands and thousands while we were out there. And because the sky was so dark, it was pristine. It was the darkest location still to this date that I've ever been. We had 22nd magnitude. Which is literally, for those who don't understand the magnitude system, that's literally about as dark as you can get on the planet.
Wow.
There's just no lights on. And it was just magical because even coming from Western Massachusetts, growing up in a suburban community where we could see the Milky Way, I had never seen the Milky Way like that. And so it was actually disorienting to the point where I couldn't even make out the constellations.
Wow.
There was just too many stars. And actually, on a moonless night, it was enough to illuminate the ground just a little bit.
Wow.
And so it was just sort of mind-blowing to know that, geez, I went to school for astronomy. I've seen the Milky Way. I've been camping in Maine and so on. But to see it like that is just a totally different ballgame.
Wow.
And then to fast forward years later, coming back to Massachusetts, working at the observatory, sort of that, I use this a lot in the presentations I give. There's that one light that sort of sets you off when you start focusing on light pollution, that one thing that you can't get out of your head. And I think that was when one of the towns that surrounds the observatory changed their streetlights overnight. So we're familiar with this issue where it seems like overnight an entire town has changed.
Yeah.
Right? They can do it in about a week or two now. And there was that one light that just sort of hits you in the eye and you're like, oh my gosh, I know what that means. There's going to be an impact to what we do. And sure enough, within a few years, we had lost the ability to see the Milky Way at the observatory.
Wow.
So I sort of look at those two experiences of one, like that Milky Way is still there, but
Yep.
then how quickly we can lose it if we're not careful.
Yeah. It's actually with just the turning on of the wrong fixture.
Yeah.
That's heartbreaking. It's all too easy to pollute with light. It's also all too easy to fix. So that's why.
That's what I try to get across, that there is this depressing part in the middle, but that this is a super easy problem to solve. It's just sort of a willpower issue at this point.
Yeah. So you mentioned that there were more asteroids that we should be worried about than you thought there were?
Well, so we know that, asteroids and things hit the Earth every day. There's little, that's why we see shooting stars, little meteors that burn up in the atmosphere. Those are little dust grains. But there's bigger things out there too. And we had not completed much of a survey, in the late 90s, early 2000s, enough to know where most of them are. Now we've cataloged a good percentage of them. But a lot of them needed to be cataloged. We need to,
Wow.
determine their orbits. And fortunately, there's not a lot that are
Okay.
heading towards the Earth
That's
that are
hopeful.
hazardous.
Okay.
But there's enough that, we keep an eye on.
Yeah.
But I don't think we found one that was alarming, like something we need to, make big plans over. But
Right.
it's important to catalog these. And, probability would say that at some point something is going to come close enough. So it's important that we
Yeah.
categorize them. And there's lots of interesting things besides whether they're going to hit the Earth. Their composition, where they come from, teaching us about how the solar system formed,
Yeah,
all
exactly.
of that
Like
stuff.
if it's from a certain star, what it's carrying on it and stuff like that.
Yeah, so, it tells us a lot about where we come from on Earth,
Yeah.
too. So.
Yeah. So how did you discover the Tim Brothers asteroid?
So that one I actually did not discover myself. So the way naming works is a little funny in astronomy. So I was part of a team, the linear team, that collectively we discovered thousands of asteroids and probably hundreds of comets over a several year program. So I was there a year, and we all did our part, and then occasionally, as part of the astronomy community, if you contribute, you get a designation.
Oh.
And so one of my colleagues, who's a big deal in the asteroid world, was kind enough to nominate me a few years ago.
Oh, that's very
And
kind.
so
Yeah.
so they take it out of a general collection. But I got a nice one. It's a few kilometers wide, and
Wow.
it's just a neat thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, there's thousands of unnamed ones, so there's plenty of room for other
Gotcha.
people. So,
Gotcha. That's awesome. That's awesome. So, how did you studied astronomy in school,
astronomy and physics. Yep.
and then you naturally, as an astronomer, were sort of outraged by the light pollution you were seeing in the world?
Yeah, you certainly are aware of it. In college, I was actually more interested at the time in radio astronomy, so the Big Bang physics and stuff. But then I decided to take a break before I'd go to, I thought, well, I'll take a year to work, and I ended up going into this optical astronomy job, which
I
was
see.
sort of a detour, and then led me into the optical world of astronomy unexpectedly. And then I just sort of stayed doing optical things over the last couple decades. So, but you certainly become aware of it, and then I think also, one of my jobs a certain period of time was running a planetarium in San Francisco, and that was my first time not only doing public outreach and engagement with a community, but particularly urban community, where you're dealing with, over the course of the year, 1,000 kids, and none of them have seen the Milky Way, and almost none of them have seen most of the stars. At most, maybe they've seen Jupiter or the moon. So there's a
Yeah.
huge disconnect. And so in the planetarium, when you change the light, so you show them the Milky Way, they are very confused of what that thing is.
Wow. Yeah.
They think you put clouds up on the screen. They don't really realize that there's this whole other thing out there.
Yeah, I'm so thankful for the dark sky experience that I had as a child. I grew up in upstate New York, and it was very dark there. But also, I can remember going to Maine and seeing it just must have hit right overhead, and it just scraped the sky, and it was orange all across our area. And then also talking to my cousins, we were out on the dock looking up at the stars, and there's this just profound experience of awe
Yeah.
where it's super scary. And I realized that my smartest cousin had no clue, what really was out there. And so when you confront that moment, I think it's so important for kids to know that adults don't have it all figured out, that we're on this spinning rock. So it breaks my heart, but I'm glad that you were part of that kind of education for students, because I feel like it's so important for kids to really be confronted with the unknown as the night sky does.
I think what it was educational for me in that sort of coming around to the conclusion that not everybody has had the privilege of seeing what I guess you and I have grown up with, growing up in suburban or rural
Yeah,
environments where you get exposed to that, or you had the opportunity to go camping.
right.
Not everybody gets the opportunity to go to, say, a national park in the Four Corners, right?
Yeah.
So that's becoming a more and more privileged experience, unfortunately. So that's something we need to understand.
It's true. In fact, darkness actually has been linked with social justice, that it's more prevalent now in communities that are more privileged. It didn't used to be like that.
Right.
Being in rural upstate New York, growing up there, I can't say I felt too excited about being in the middle of nowhere
Yeah.
at the time. But now I'm very, very thankful for that experience. So, yeah. So, where did you grow up?
Western Mass,
Okay.
so specifically like Southampton, Holyoke area, suburban
Yeah.
area. Went to school at UMass Amherst in Amherst, and so that was my area. But we were on the edge of the Berkshires, and then close enough to the cities of Holyoke and Springfield, so we had a little bit of everything in that area.
Yeah, and speaking of how LEDs can kind of come in overnight, I think of the Berkshires as being a very connected community to the environment. But if you look at the light pollution map, actually at times as intense as Boston through that Pioneer Valley. So I always kind of use that as an example of a community that sort of had light pollution sneak in kind of unbeknownst and kind of under their own feet. So,
Yeah, having just gave a talk in the Berkshires for a botanical society, I actually generated for my talk one of these light pollution maps for them. I usually try to do that for whatever community I go in because I think it's important to sort of draw a connection with what does exactly your community look like from space. And I was actually even surprised. I mean, I knew Pittsfield would be bright, which is a major industrial city for those who don't know. But even the smaller communities, where places like where you would go to see Tanglewood, the amphitheater and some of the vacationing areas, they're largely filled in now. There's still very dark areas, but there's a lot of areas that are filled in now that, from my rough assessment, that you probably can't see the Milky Way on a regular night anymore, which is sort of shocking in a hill
yeah.
town.
Yeah, totally.
But we see a lot of changes in the Berkshires too. We see the introduction of, LED grow houses for various things, marijuana production facilities. You see glamping, in the summertime where, you have these fully lit up cabins as opposed to campsites. So things have
Right.
changed and what are people using the space for?
Yeah. A question I wanted to ask you before, which is related to your astronomy background,
Yeah.
but what's your favorite movie
Ooh,
with
that's a good one.
regard to space?
Uh, I think in terms of like a serious space movie, 2001
Okay.
is something I enjoy, and my oldest son loves watching that with me. But I'm still a hardcore Star Wars geek at heart.
Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Gotcha. I was thinking of Contact when you were talking about the asteroid and also radio physics, because that
Yeah.
was kind of like a big.
That's a great movie. The book is also great. Don't Look Up was another
Oh,
good one. That's like
yes.
reasonably, I think, despite being tongue in cheek, is actually pretty accurate. But
Wow.
yeah,
Wow. Yeah. I know. That made me think a lot,
yeah.
actually. So you're the manager of the observatory. So what does that entail?
So the fun part is teaching students and the public about the night sky, teaching them how to use the equipment, particularly the robotic telescopes. So I teach them how to do it, how to so if they come to us with a project they're not familiar with how to do, say observing an asteroid or an exoplanet, which is one of these planets around a star that's not our own. And I help them sort of figure out how to use the equipment, how to observe it appropriately, and get the data that they are looking for to complete their project, whether it's for a class or a thesis, or maybe they're an outside researcher that comes and wants to use the facility. a lot of my job lately is telescope automation. So essentially trying to replace myself in some sense so I can sleep at night and script the telescope. So it reads the weather, it knows when to open up, it has a queue of objects, it prioritizes depending on who you are, what the object is, and it observes a variety of things. So for example, last night it observed the moons around Uranus for one student, and it observed an asteroid, and in the next couple of days we'll be switching back to exoplanets. So that's kind of thing we generally do. And then also just managing the site, making sure it operates. So a lot of students now, especially because of traffic, Boston, we're off campus, so it takes sometimes 2 hours to get to the observatory.
Yeah, it's far. Yeah.
So we've actually built on campus a remote control station, so they can operate about 5 of the telescopes at any given time from campus.
Oh.
And so making sure that all of that works. So we had been working on this for years, but then with COVID, it really came in handy that we had sort of developed a lot of this technology to say that they still have to be out at the observatory initially to like hands-on learn how to use how to see how the night sky moves, see how the telescopes move. But then once they're sort of ready, they can control it remotely from campus, and that's been really neat.
Wow. Yeah.
And then we do a lot of tours, so getting the public, whether it's local students or from the surrounding communities, coming, and just many of them have never seen a telescope, or if they have, they've never seen something with larger telescopes. So we have several 14-inch and several 2 24-inch telescopes. So these are larger telescopes, research grade, that you can really zoom in on details and see a galaxy, see a nebula, seeing the rings around Saturn in really legible detail.
Wow, that's
and so that's really
incredible.
exciting. So we just had a Girl Scout troop last week. That was really fun, and seeing their eyes light up and
Yeah.
see be a little bit inspired is really fun.
That's amazing. When was the observatory built?
1971,
And when did you come on?
2009.
So I would venture to say that in 1971, it probably had very good access to the night sky.
Yes, yeah, it was considerably darker, and even when I arrived in 2009.
That was what I was going to ask.
Yeah,
next.
it was quite a bit different. I mean, there was still light domes from, say, the city of Lowell, which is a city of about 150,000 or so. And that was always like, okay, we can't really look over there too much. But everywhere else was pretty good, especially towards New Hampshire in the north and the smaller towns of Groton and Dunstable, which had, we're talking about 10, 15,000 person
Sure.
towns, so not terribly well developed. Those towns changed. Westford is built up, the town that surrounds us for the most part. And what I mean by change is add strip mall after strip mall after strip mall.
Yeah.
That coupled with residential lighting, I think, is probably the biggest change. So people uplighting everything in their yard, from shrubbery to bushes to plaques to rock walls, to show how big their house is, those kind of lights. The garden lights that are on 24/7
Yep.
because they're solar powered.
Yeah.
I think all of that is sort of this cumulative effect. I don't think it's one thing anymore.
Sure.
But we sort of used to, I think I sort of used to think it was just the street lights.
They actually did a study. It's actually mostly not the streetlights at this point, which was, kind of mind bending, because you think of the public street lighting as being the main source of light. But
Right.
to what you're describing, the availability of light since LEDs, it's not only cheap to buy LEDs, it's cheap to run them. And I have a picture that I took in Home Depot.
Yeah.
And the anchor aisles is often how we educate consumers. And I'll never forget it. I went in hoping to find something, and it was right there. It said brighter light, easy install. So with that messaging, there's no check to any kind of counterbalance or consequence to light at night, because it just doesn't occur to most humans. It's not intuitive to know.
Yeah, and the big box store is a really good example. So I've been through this several times, and I'm sure you have too, where you hear a sales associate explain that the brightest light, the best light, is this super bright daylight blue, and this is what you want for your post top light or your exterior door lights, and then you see that materialize, right?
Yeah.
Or that you look at their displays, and I've counted before. Something like 2 out of 30 or 40 lights will be dark sky compliant that they show for exterior lighting.
Yeah.
So you can't blame the consumer entirely for choosing the wrong thing if you're not
true.
presenting them with more options.
It's true. I think it was that same visit. I was in the lighting aisle, and this woman asked me for help, and I was like, of course.
Sure.
But at that point, she doesn't know what 2700K means, and so I helped her. But yeah, a 5000K light on the inside you're missing all of the infinite reflections that's happening off the landscape. And it's very harsh. It's very
And
intense.
the color temperature, the CCT, is easy to pick on. But as
Yes.
we know, there's like this whole other story. Like I just put on new doorway lights myself because I'm redoing our front, and they're fully shielded and they're 2700K, great. And I wanted ones that you could actually put in your own bulb, but it's very hard because they're all integrated for the most part.
Yeah.
And I think each one is something like 500 lumens. And what I found is, gosh, 500 times two, that is too much.
Right.
That for me, that
Yeah.
was like really excessive.
Yeah.
But there's not much, there's not a lot of options. So, they're affordable, yes, but it would be nice if we had more options to really tailor it to your property.
Sure. Like a 100 lumen light would be gorgeous. This like little glow
Accent
of light.
lighting,
Yeah,
'cause
exactly.
as I've explained in my talks too often, is that anybody who knows when the full moon is up, you can actually do a night hike, right? Like you can actually walk around and navigate at night with the full moon. But we're putting in orders of hundreds of times more light, right? So we both know that that's not always necessary.
Oh,
And
yeah. Yeah.
so, I mean, I think there's still work to be done.
Yeah. Well, it's much more beautiful. I mean, when you look at theater design, which a lot of people in the lighting industry come from theater, but theater lighting is often using darkness to then bring in the human imagination for what's sort of just out of view. And design that does that is also very beautiful because you get that kind of glowing contrast. When the contrast is too big, the darkness just becomes so deepened and almost like you're looking in through a tunnel of light and missing everything. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah. Yeah. So, you also in Pepperell, there's a 2200K installation, and I just
Yes.
want to say that I do hope somehow the lighting industry starts to move away from correlated color temperature and into spectral power densities so
Yeah.
that we can really, because one 2700K could be very different than another 2700K.
Well, I can attest to that because part of that whole Pepperell project, a lot of people may not totally understand, is that we didn't just choose out of the blue 2200K. I didn't choose that. The town chose it, and they chose it out of a blind study. So essentially,
Interesting.
we put up 5 or 6 different LED packages, and we threw in the high pressure sodium as a control. We didn't tell anybody what they were voting on. So the town people voted on what they preferred.
Interesting.
So a bunch of the lights, so we put a cap on the CCT at 2700 for the project.
Okay.
I was able to at least get that in.
That's good.
So I think there was 4 different 2700Ks. The 2200K was a late addition. So Cooper Lighting had just released that. No one else had these yet. And we're like, great. I mean, that's cool. I've never seen that before. I gathered that it would be close to amber. I wasn't sure what to expect.
I'll just interject that
Yeah.
since we're throwing around color temperature numbers, 2200K is like the orange embers of a fire. And 3000K would be more like the white flame off of a fire. For anyone listening that's not familiar with correlated color temperatures.
Yeah, and I would just my perception is 2700 is just a slight touch yellow,
Yes. Yep.
just
that
a
makes
hair.
sense. Yeah.
So the interesting thing was even with the 2700K, wildly different results because of the optics packages. So the glare. So that sort of pointed to the fact that CCT is actually, especially when you're talking about things like glare, really doesn't matter. It's the optics. It's how condensed. It's the number of LEDs. So
Yeah.
and they were all set to the same output. So people got to see, what a different optics package looks like. Some are glary, some are more expensive, some are not. And it turns out the 2200K, just as a footnote, was the cheapest option. So after all this, we're sort of taught that the best environmental choice is the most expensive. This was not the case.
Right. Yeah.
And that's what people chose. They actually chose the 2 lights they liked the most was the original high pressure sodium.
That's where they were coming from.
Yes.
That probably
And
helped. Yeah.
It was, and the 2200K is very similar
Yeah.
color appearance to the human eye to the high pressure sodium. It's close enough. And so I think there was a familiarity.
For sure.
That's my guess.
Yeah.
We have some survey data that, we're going to hopefully publish the case study at some point next year.
Great. I'd love to see that.
We've sort of, I'll get into why we've delayed it a little bit in a second, but we had this survey. And so the interesting thing was we operated them at the first week at full brightness, 100%. So matching the original high pressure sodium, whatever that was. So that in terms of, outputting the number of lumens or foot candles, however that worked out. And then the second week we dimmed them by half and didn't tell people.
Love it.
And most people didn't really notice, but they generally were totally fine with it. And that's the case we found in other places too. So for the town of Westford, when they did their LED streetlight, we got to them early enough in the process where we convinced them to do 3,000 K because that was the best you could do, fully shielded, and they put in the smart controllers. And then they didn't use the smart controllers for the first year or so. And then eventually I was sort of pressuring them, like, could we try, especially the ones near the observatory, could we dim them by some percent? And I wasn't sure what to ask for. So I was like, could you at least dim them by 30% or 50%? And a few months later, I saw no change. And I bugged them again and I said, could we really try it? Even just the one near our driveway. I just want to see what it looks like, see if I can tell. And they're like, oh, a few months ago, we dimmed all of the streetlights by half.
Wow.
So even I couldn't notice. No one has noticed to this day. And in Pepperell, we sort of learned from that and said, okay, if no one notices at 50%, how much further could we go?
Yeah.
So the way it's operating now, the first and last 2 hours of the night are 50% from what the high pressure sodium was.
Okay.
In the middle 6 or so hours, all those middle hours are down to 30% brightness. So it's a 70% reduction.
So it gets brighter before.
So in the beginning, it's 50% of what it used to be.
Okay. So at dusk.
So the lumen package, it's actually cut in half. Yeah, dusk and dawn are at 50%.
I see. That makes
and then
sense.
all those middle hours, those dark hours, it's all the way down to 30% brightness.
Yeah. It's really working with the adaptation of the eye.
Yeah. And, one of the things was, well, what's going to happen? Is this legal?
Litigious thinking.
Yeah. So it turns out there's really no laws about that, as far as I can tell.
Okay.
And no one complained. There's no increase in traffic accidents. There's no increase in crime. And this is from the police department.
Wow.
And so that tells us, okay, we can do this. And it's not going to work for every community, but for a rural community where there's no nightlife and everything shuts down by, 8 or 9 p.m. at most, why not? Because the only people that are driving around at night is probably me and the police.
Yeah.
Yeah, so when I do these light surveys, and checking different areas to see quantitatively how this has changed, and that's partly why we've sort of delayed the case study, because I wanted to see, we took before data of sky glow, we took after, and then I wanted to see, did the percent change over year that we were seeing before, did that pick up again? And so I've done a few more years after that, trying to match it with the same moon phase, same time of year, same foliage, to try to detangle some of these things. And, we'll see. But what I can tell you is that doing this with the streetlights, because streetlights did dominate this community in terms of lighting, did reduce sky glow.
That's amazing.
But that will change over time as more and more commercial and residential lighting is added, right? Because it's just simple addition at that point. Because we didn't change the number of streetlights.
Yeah, that's amazing. I love that you are dimming the lighting for the community and kind of ask, if you tell them, there's going to be people who will just object outright.
Yes.
So it's interesting to sort of psychologically see how the lighting's perceived kind of by silently dimming the lights down. I had heard early on in the lighting industry that if you dim lights by within 30%, people will not notice. So you're kind of stretching that even further. I think that's sort of within the room you're in at the time of the dimming.
Yeah.
So I think if people are not there to witness the fluctuation, then they're not going to notice. As you probably have a bigger way of actually dimming it. So
yeah, I think if we had gone from in the beginning of the night 100 to 50 to 30 or something like that, it would have been a little bit more noticeable. But because we're starting with 50, and it turns out you can see just fine, and there's not as much glare because we've really squashed that blue down.
Yeah.
So and there's a good optics package too. So generally you don't see a lot of the light directly in your eye.
Yeah.
And then I think one of the reasons why this project took the shape it did with community involvement was because I bothered to ask other communities so at this point, previous to us, we were the outlier. So most of Massachusetts had already converted, and we'd seen plenty of bad examples and a few good examples.
Yeah.
And so I just started cold calling towns and saying, okay, for your project, what was the feedback, and what do you think helped or hurt it? And it seemed the universal thing I heard from towns that seemed like people were actually pleased with the outcome was that there was community engagement.
Yeah.
That the town bothered to ask people the question, like, what do you prefer? And also that if they gave a demo, the outcome was even better.
Yeah.
So if they gave people some input, showed off examples, because sometimes the company will come to you, especially if it's, say, a power company, and they sort of just say, this will cut your rates, but they don't sort of explain what are the other impacts of whatever that change is to the community, especially if it's a downtown area. That can have a lot of impact.
There's a lot of research that on workers that if you give them control of temperature and lighting, that you actually have reduced absenteeism. So in that same vein, I think by offering autonomy and choice to the community, you engaged them and had a better result. And it really is key. That's why I think that controls are super important because they allow for advocacy over time through engagement. And I think that's also important just when you bring in the idea of social justice, because this rural community is going to have different needs than a downtown community that maybe has more crime to contend with. So when you engage the community, they will tell you your needs, and then therefore we can use the light really how it's needed and how it can best serve the community, and then avoid overlighting when possible.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the key, is just giving people a voice, because I think if what the parallel to this, what didn't go well in the town of Pepperell, this is the other half of the story.
Interesting.
We were trying to pass a general bylaw. It was very aggressive, and Pepperell is not a town that is, it doesn't like regulations. Let's put it that way.
Okay.
And so I think we pushed too hard, and we tried to be too encompassing, and sort of learned a lot of lessons from that.
Yeah.
But I think that was sort of, you see the two different outcomes. The bylaw failed by 7 votes, which was painful.
Yeah.
But the streetlight program went really well and accomplished a lot of the goals of the bylaw. Because I think even the people who were sort of naysayers to the regulations part
Sure.
did participate in the study.
Yeah. And you're leading the way because, if you look at Times Square, at all the surrounding neighborhoods to Times Square are forced into lighting brighter because, the light is addictive. So you've now created sort of a gravitational force of a healthy amount of light that maybe will influence the rest of the community decision making.
Do you think that's because sort of just human-wise it appears darker if you go the other way, so that they sort of feel like it's unsafe?
Absolutely, because your eye doesn't have time to adapt from the brightness of the one community to the darker community, and it just sort of goes building by building, facade by facade, that suddenly you're the one in the dark. So it's very addictive in terms of lighting.
Okay.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, but that's why we need to sort of re-addict humanity to what is the wonder of the night sky.
And I think, to your point, giving people control, like direct control, I think is really exciting. The funny thing that I don't know what your experience is, but a lot of communities have spent the money, or the state has spent the money on controls, and then they don't use them.
Oh, 100%. In fact, controls is very hard to educate about. I can show you a light, I can dim it, I can show you it off and on, but controls is sort of this nebulous thing that you don't really ever see. I mean, there's a node, it's very boring, and it connects usually to a dashboard. And unless you have access to that dashboard, you're not going to use it.
Yeah.
So it has led to a lot of faulty adoptions.
And talking to some of the larger municipalities, like, say, the DC area, that have put in some of these controls, but then talking to them, they're sort of afraid to go tweak it any further, because I think they just don't have anybody on, maybe on staff that can say, okay, well, this is the appropriate level. Understandably, most of us don't have a education in lighting design, right? So we don't know. This is why we rely on, some of the people in our chapter to sort of check us on when we write these regulations is, what is the appropriate amount of light? And that's a complicated
It's very
thing to
complicated.
detangle.
Yeah. I will say that, in the 2015 time period, controls sort of felt like a Wild West.
Yeah.
Everyone was trying to win the market share. A lot of companies went out of business. They left kind of some communities on an island with just attic stock of what was available. But controls have come a long way. We work with a company, Ubiquia.
Yeah.
They have an excellent node, an excellent dash board, and you can actually control down to a single fixture in a community. I think people are hesitant to adopt controls because when something goes wrong with controls, it is pretty scary.
Yeah.
However, I say at this point, not including controls in your lighting specification is like buying a laptop without Wi-Fi, because then you don't really have an understanding of what's out there and what's happening, and it can kind of give you that global view in the same way, like for your students, being able to have that remote access is extraordinarily helpful. But an undertaking of technology that people are often very daunted by. It's a lot easier now, though, I will say.
I think that's one of the things we've heard feedback too is that, when you don't have a lighting professional on staff, especially if you're a small to medium-sized town, and maybe it's just an administrator, it needs to be a simple interface for people to use it. I would say one of the other selling points in our town for using controls was that you're also not locked into the lower numbers. That, let's say there's an accident or a water main break, you can raise it back up to 100%. If you need some extra
Right.
light in that specific area, that's a cool tool. And so that was also sort of attractive to say that, like, you have some flexibility on the fly. You can make some changes, which I think is really neat.
Absolutely. And because LEDs degrade in light levels over time, you can also dim up the wattage so that you can maintain the same light level and kind of get a little bit longer of a time period out of your lighting installation, which is also very helpful.
That's interesting. That's a good point.
Yeah. So, you are the co-founder of the IDA MA chapter. When did you guys launch the IDA? Oh, sorry, the Dark Sky.
Yeah, we're Dark Sky International
Yes.
now. So long ago. I think it was like, Kelly Beatty and James Lowenthal and I
Yeah.
have been talking about this for a while, that, there's some assemblances of different groups that were not part of IDA and then became Dark Sky later
Sure.
throughout New England. And there had been this languishing legislative effort
I wanna
for
get
years,
into that too.
far before my time getting involved. And so there was a few particular people like Kelly Beatty and Mario Mata, Dr. Mario Mata, who's well known in the medical field, talking about light pollution, who had been pushing this for decades before me. And we thought, well, if we organized a little bit better, we pulled in, and once we realized that I think Massachusetts has like something like the highest per capita membership for the Dark Sky group.
Oh, wow.
I think partially because there's a lot of astronomers, but partially there's just a lot of activists and people who care about it for other reasons, biological and
Sure. Yeah.
pollinators and all sorts of other issues. There's a bunch of lighting designers, as you know. And so we thought, well, what if we pulled all of those people together?
Yeah.
So I think it was about 5 or so years ago, we talked about it, and then, they let us do it. And I served as vice president for a few years and then sort of stepped back to let other people get in there. But it's been really fun, and we've gotten, I think, a fair amount done. I think sometimes it's a little discouraging on the big policy front, but
Yes.
but I think we've created a lot of awareness. I mean, I learned a lot just having the chapter, learning from other people in the chapter, and then having that strong connection to headquarters, and also getting us connected with other experts, lighting designers, that we were able to educate ourselves enough where we were able to start getting some of these projects done. So whether it's the Pepperell project, and now there's other communities, I think Shelburne is installing the same lights now.
Oh, that's great.
We've helped a bunch of towns everywhere from the Berkshires to the eastern part of the state write bylaws. We've been looking at building codes and things like that. And now some of us are looking at campuses. So, being MIT, if you know MIT campus, it's pretty horrible in terms of lighting. And we have an opportunity right now. They're about to landscape a good portion of the campus.
Wow.
And so we're hopeful. They've been actually sort of appreciative of the input. And I think there's a chance that we could maybe really fix a lot of the
That's amazing.
the lighting there too, and show an example to because we have a lot of college campuses around here.
Truly. Yeah.
So
Yeah. I do think it'll be one installation at a time that will slowly reclaim. darkness. And I will say, in my work, we're a lighting agency, and we are hearing more and more communities come to us asking for dark sky installations. So it's nice to see that coming from the communities, because at the end of the day, it's really got to be the communities choosing it, as we've kind of been talking about. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's kind of on par with what I was saying earlier. You just can't really force it. And so now
Right.
that I think we've sort of primed the pump, we've done a lot of talks, many of us. We've gotten into the communities and done all of the library talks and gotten into the press and stuff. And I think it's sort of it's permeated to the town level where now people are saying, well, when we do this project, let's make sure it's meeting this code or meeting this specification.
Yeah. So, tell me about how it's going on the Massachusetts state level. I know that's been fraught.
It's
So, what's been happening?
so uh, I think this was my 7th year working on the bill in its various forms. What's happened is that we've made a little bit of progress each time, and part of that was just like with the municipal level, we had to educate legislators and tell them why this is important and why they need to spend their time on this. The problem is we don't have the most efficient legislature, to be honest, and so this is not on the
Interesting.
merits of the bill. In fact,
Yeah.
we've never had any negative testimony, to my knowledge, about the bill.
Wow.
We have bipartisan support. We have support from, you know, everybody from astronomers to medical doctors, medical societies, all of the museums, the zoos, every trustees and Audubon and Sierra Club. I mean, everybody you can think of has supported this bill. I think this past session, I think we probably made it the farthest we've made it, which is out of hundreds of environmental bills, we were one of, I think, 11 that made it out of committee.
Wow.
So we did really well. We were told we were going to be part of the climate bill. And then anybody who's been following the climate bill in Massachusetts knows that's not really gone super well. I know they just passed it, I think it was yesterday, but it does not include a lot of things that should have been in there. So lots of permitting things for big projects like solar and wind, which are important, but a lot of the details because lighting is really the low-hanging fruit in terms of like what we could do right now. We don't need to invent new technology. We have
100%.
already invested in the infrastructure.
Yeah.
And the bill was really simple, capping it at 3,000 K, which is a pretty modest cap.
Yep.
But we also wrote an off-ramp to say, okay, if you can provide some safety reason, you can go up to 4,000 K. So we
Interesting.
really compromised. We had everybody from the IES, which is the Illuminating Engineering Society, the IALD, which is the Lighting Designers.
Yep.
Everybody signed on. So even sort of what used to be quote unquote our arch enemies in some sense, people we used to sort of disagree a lot, came together and said, this is a bill we can all agree on.
Yeah.
So no opposition, but did not make the cut. And they actually chose just to not vote on it. So it was actually just pulled out of the bill.
Wow.
So, and that happened to many bills. I mean, it wasn't just us. It was,
Interesting.
I don't think it was personal to anything we did in our bill. The really sad part, and this gets to the controls part, is that this bill would actually save towns and cities money.
Yeah.
So, in particular, my town. So right now, National Grid, for example, is allowed to charge. They charge your because streetlights are unmetered. A lot of people don't realize that. They charge your town in bins, and so the lowest bin is 25 watts, and that might seem pretty low, but the thing is now with LEDs that are becoming more and more efficient year over year, plus controls using less. So if you're dimming, you're using even less. So Pepperell is using 12.9 watts on average,
Interesting. Yeah.
but they're still allowed to charge us 25 watts.
Right.
So
Right.
we are
there's no
overpaying by
incentive
40%.
to go lower.
Right. So we just did it because that's what the town wanted. But a lot of towns don't see an incentive. So we've actually talked to towns who are not bothering dimming. That was getting into like why I was saying we're not
Yeah.
using the controls because there's no economic incentive
Right.
unless there's activists up talking about dark sky work.
Yeah.
And so this bill would have fixed that, would have forced the power companies to renegotiate the rates. So we are charged what we're using because to your point about these, very smart controllers, they have basically Excel spreadsheets, right? It could just tabulate in 2 seconds what you're using.
For sure.
And then you could charge what you're using just like you do in your home electric bill. That's the way it should be.
Yeah.
So instead, we're subsidizing essentially the power companies millions and millions of dollars every year out of taxpayer money, which is not good for our pocketbooks, but also not good for the environment, right? Because that's a lot of carbon we could reduce, right?
Oh, 100%. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
so those are the kind of things I wish we got done. We'll see next session. I don't know what our strategy is going to be, but it's a challenge, but it's not on the merits of dark sky work.
Yeah.
It's just the way the legislature functions. But as it remains today, we are still the only state in the Northeast without having passed lighting legislation.
Wow, that's unfortunate. And it does sound like it's kind of caught up in other initiatives, and so it's sort of like we're waiting for the moment when this suddenly catches. Yeah.
I think we'll eventually get there. In the meantime, we're just going to have to continue the patchwork nature of zoning bylaws and building codes. And one thing I've discovered is a far easier lift that can have almost as much impact, which is getting into the town's master plan. So if that comes up every 10 years, you can have some input and really decide the direction and
Yeah.
sort of force the hand of the town to consider
Yeah.
stronger. Design guidelines is another thing I discovered, that you don't need to pass with a town vote. You really just need to get often, a building committee or a planning board to pass. And that has enforceable limits on, say, lighting. So we were able to get in a few places that sort of language to say, making sure at least trespass when you're building a new housing complex, that it stays confined, or that everything has to be fully shielded.
Yeah.
So there are other ways, other tricks we're learning.
Yeah. It's interesting to me that the argument is suddenly saving money again, because that's how we started this entry point into this unchecked natural disaster we weren't expecting of light pollution, was that we can save you money, and so we're more energy efficient. But then we added so many more LEDs that we lost our energy savings and we lost our money savings and wound up with light pollution. But I think it's now suddenly we can start peeling that back and getting money back for people. Although I'm hesitant only because of how we got here. Energy efficiency for me is kind of a dirty term as a result of that. So
That's an interesting point. I get asked that a lot too, and say like, well, should we go back to the high pressure sodium? Are LEDs bad? And I said, well, the LED technology is not bad. Let's be clear about that. I'm not
Yeah.
saying throw away LEDs and go back in time. That's not a good idea. But just use it wisely and put
Exactly.
some little bit of thought into it. I think is really the key. I'm a big fan of like, not 100% changes, but like if we can start advocating for 10 or 15 or 20% changes,
Sure.
those kind of things are more palatable, and I think we can make some progress.
For sure, for sure. So, tell me about some recent astronomical phenomena. So, did you see totality, by the way?
Yes, this has been a super exciting year for me personally. I had a couple bucket list items.
Yeah.
One was seeing a total eclipse, and I got to see that in Hardwick, Vermont.
Nice. I was actually in right on Lake Champlain in Burlington. Yeah.
We were actually supposed to go there the morning of, like early that morning. We got up. I got the jitters. I saw some clouds moving towards
interesting.
towards that area, and we pivoted like with minutes to go, and headed to Hardwick and went to a school on a hilltop, and it was just
Nice.
and then we had this like random collection of people that just showed up, right? So we had 100 people who never met each other. We all hung out, and it was super fun, and the kids got to see it, and even for me, who has seen a lot of neat things, it was pretty mind blowing.
Yeah.
And I got some nice pictures. So
Yeah, we had about 3 minutes of totality. And again, it was all these strangers. And instead of us looking at our, fractured screens separate from one another, we were all looking at that same first screen of the sky and putting our attention on this one point. And it was super bonding, and it was over something very neutral. Not politics,
Yeah.
nothing divisive at all. And so, yeah, and the moment when you see that darkness come, and it's extreme. It was extraordinarily moving for me. Yeah.
yeah, I like I said, I mean, I think moving. Well, I think moving is the right word, and I think even the number of cool things I've seen, that was top of that was top. I mean, I it just especially. I think pictures don't do it justice, and then
Definitely
not only
not.
just sort of this black hole in the middle of the sky, but the fire at the edges. The
Oh, yes.
that
The
it was so bright. It looked
horizon.
like a laser coming out of the edge of it, and it just was so mind blowing. And all the other weird atmospheric effects, how it got colder, and then to our point about controls, the parking lot lights came on because it got dark
Interesting.
enough.
Yeah.
And so there was just 100 things that happened all at once in those 3 minutes, and
Yeah.
I hope I never forget all of the things, and it was really cool. And if the funny thing was too that, sort of obviously I'm really into astronomy, but not everybody that's their hobby.
Right.
But immediately afterward, everyone in our group was like, how do we plan to get to the next one? Everyone was sort of let down that it ended, I think. That it was
Yeah.
just, come back. you know?
Yeah, 3
You know?
minutes is short, although it definitely felt long, but it's a short experience, and it is so lucky because anything could happen. The weather could be bad. It might not be in your area. I mean, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, that's the life of an astronomer, especially in New England, is that we have to cancel things and close up all the time. It's supposed to be clear for a class. It's supposed to be clear for a tour. Random clouds appear. You never know. Haze, smoke from fires. I mean, there's
Right.
been a lot of things
Yeah.
that have worked against us. Never mind light pollution. And then the second thing was these auroras.
Yes, I was going to ask about that.
And that was my other bucket list item. I figured I had to go to Canada or Iceland someday, and then we're gonna have to plan this bucket list trip, in retirement or something, and then go figure a solar maximum that was originally predicted to be not that exciting
Yeah.
turned out to be more than exciting, and the most exciting that I've ever seen in terms of sunspots and flares,
Wow.
and then these auroras that I have pictures from I think 3 or 4 different nights that I was able to capture it. Whether it was at the observatory, even in our light polluted skies, or at home in Pepperell, where we still have pretty dark skies. It was eerie, because
Wow.
a million times there's been predictions that we're gonna maybe this will be the time Massachusetts sees it, over
Sure.
my lifetime, and you go out and you're sort of like, okay, there's nothing there, and this time. It was just awash in
Wow.
pink and
Yeah.
reds and purples and greens and just and then it would go away and then it would come back, and it was pretty wild.
That's beautiful. I didn't know that the auroras could be pink, actually. That's kind of what I learned from the experience in Massachusetts.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, I didn't know what to expect, and I think if it was just white, it would have been cool. But the fact that it was all these weird colors and sort of trippy, it was a lot of fun.
yeah.
And again, kids got to see it and got people outside at night. So I think
It's
I think
good.
it's always it's a good thing for us that we're getting people out and sort of experiencing some wonder.
For sure. Exactly.
Yeah.
Wonder is unlimited. And I really do feel that not having access to that point of the unknown is very limiting for how our thoughts transpire. So I love that we've had these recent astronomical phenomena to get people to kind of reacquaint themselves. It's been very lucky. So how old are your kids, if you don't mind me asking?
Oldest is 14,
Oh, wow.
and the youngest just turned 12.
Yeah, so
So-
they're very lucky to have a dad that's kind of inviting them to look at the night sky.
Yeah, the older one is more the one who's interested in this stuff. That they tend to sort of be into different things, but they've both experienced all these things, and so it's been really fun. And especially when they were younger, they've spent a fair amount of time at the observatory, especially when you're sort
Yeah.
of like, sometimes lacking childcare, and they just sort of hang out, and they've helped out a lot and got to see a lot of these cool things too. So it's been fun.
Yeah.
And I'm just fortunate that we live in a place where we can go on the back deck and see shooting stars in the Milky Way, and they get to experience that.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a counterbalance that you're offering, which I would say most kids are not. The statistic is 8 out of 10 school children no longer have access to
Yeah.
the night sky, which is really 80% of humanity that does not. And so, and I can't imagine when I grew up, the internet, I kind of came up with the internet.
Yeah,
So I remember before.
right.
But for the kids these days, they are inundated with light-driven information constantly. So it's very nice that you can offer that counterbalance to your kids through your work.
I'm happy to do it. Yeah. Because I think no matter what it is, I think it's important to be inspired early on. They don't have to, I'm not encouraging them to go into astronomy, but I think just have something to inspire you that there's a bigger world, whether it's, fish under the ocean or stars in the sky. It's important to have something that challenges you.
For sure, for
It
sure.
makes you feel a little small,
Yeah, oh, definitely. Yeah, I think it's a great perspective for daily living to know that there's so much we don't know.
Yeah.
And great for problem solving too. So you have chickens.
I do have chickens.
Do
Right
they-
now, 15.
Wow.
Yeah.
Do you have roosters?
I have one rooster.
Is that all you need?
We accidentally had a couple other ones that we sent them to a different farm.
I
3
see.
was too much for us and the neighbors. We do have neighbors. But yeah, we grow as much of our own food as we can in our
Wow.
front yard. We moved our garden to the front yard because that's facing south, and our chicken coop is out there too. And yeah, that's great. We grow our own food, and chickens provide, and they're also really fun pets.
I've heard that
Yeah.
actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I didn't really expect that. They say not to name them, but how can you not name them funny
Yeah,
names?
totally.
And yeah, so we've got 14 hens and one silly rooster. And
What's the funniest name?
so the rooster is named Tauntaun.
Okay.
So we did not expect him to be a rooster. He was actually also supposed to be a bantam, which is a small chicken. So my wife
Okay.
got it as a joke, sort of.
I see.
'Cause she knew I didn't want fancy chickens. And so he's a silky, if you're familiar with those. They're popular on TikTok. And he not only is a full size, but also he's a male. He's a rooster. And so his name is Tauntaun after the Star Wars creature. He kind of looks like one of those riding around in the the winter planet of Hoth. And
I'm not really a Star Wars
Okay,
person.
fair
so
enough.
Lost on me, sorry. But
Okay.
I'm sure our listeners will enjoy it.
yeah,
so,
they'll love
yeah.
it. But we've got ones every from Frankie to we've got my son likes to name them after constellations or stars, so Sirius and stuff like that. So
And so does the rooster crow in the morning?
yes,
So sometimes that's annoying. I can kind of tell by the look
yes,
on your face.
yeah. So he this morning he was a little intense, but right now our windows are shut. In the summer it's more of a problem.
I
But he's
see.
also 100 feet from our house, so it's all relative. So they are very tuned to
Well,
day and night
this
cycles.
is what I wanted to ask.
Yeah.
So he obviously does not observe daylight savings.
No.
And so is it like kind of changing by the minute as the sunset and sunrise
Yeah,
goes?
it's pretty regular. Like in the morning, he crows a lot, like throughout the day, but he goes off in this sequence right at dawn.
Wow.
So
Yeah.
right before the sun rises, he'll get up, and I think he's probably like calling the ladies out to go eat and drink water and stuff because they're in the coop part. There's a run part. He coaxes them out too.
I see.
And he goes off, and then once it starts getting just a little bit, like I would say sort of like not when it's dusk, but like a little bit before, maybe like
Sure.
civil twilight or something like that. He starts calling them back up to the coop
Oh,
and brings them back up.
wow. I guess I didn't know about the dusk activity.
Yeah, and if a little bit of light disturbs them, like say I'm coming home from
Yeah.
observing 2, 3 in the morning or whatever weird hour I'm coming in, and I'll trip up. We have some motion sensor lights throughout the yard, one in front of their coop, so that way we know if like a bear is there or something like that. And if that trips off, he'll actually wake up and start crowing.
Wow.
So instantly he sort of says, "Oh, it's daytime,
yeah.
time to go off."
Yeah. What a little mini experiment to just
Yeah.
discuss the
I
impacts.
would love to go in depth with do an experiment with chickens. I think that would be a lot of fun
Wow.
to figure out because some people put lights on them all the time.
Poultry farms do that too.
They do that to extend
Yeah.
their production, and that can really burn out the hens. It's not really
Makes
the natural
sense.
cycle. They need a break.
Yeah.
So the winter, their production slows down. They don't produce as many eggs, and so there's that whole sort of natural biological cycle
Sure.
that we don't use any lights in the coop other than we have some red Christmas lights I set to dusk just so they can find their way into the coop and find the nesting bar, but it turns on for like half an hour.
Wow.
But some people put heat lamps, which is not only dangerous, but that can keep them up all night long.
Yeah.
And yes, you get more eggs, but they might not last as long. So
Red light and birds actually, when we're talking about the color of light, red light, often people will say, oh, well, we'll just use red light because it's not so bad for turtles.
right.
And, we use that nautically. But actually with birds, not only does it make them produce more eggs, which I think is kind of creepy,
Yeah.
but also it can send birds to migrate in the wrong direction because it interferes with their magnetoreception.
Really.
Yes, so it's that's why I say there's nothing to replace darkness. There's no
Yeah.
color of light that's going to get humans their light at night that doesn't have impact because it changes across all species.
Yeah, it's something we think about a lot, and it's one of the things I try to cover when I do these like sort of garden botanical talks that I've been on lately is so despite we're on a major road, despite being a rural community, we're on a major route in town, and so it's a busy road, and there are, and so to protect not only the garden but also the chickens, we have sort of natural barriers. We let sort of shrubbery and trees grow up to block some of that passing light, so they're not as much disturbed. And then we have a couple sort of fences that like screen fences that sort of block some of that too to try to keep it dark.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think that's really cool that you have these animals, right, that you're living with that are so tied to the natural daylight cycle. With a rooster, you can't get something more obviously telling you that it's sunrise and sunset. So it's pretty amazing.
Yeah, in a way, they're funny little creatures that we have, and we name them, but they are very primitive, and
Yes.
and they have just a couple inputs, and one of them is light. So it's been really interesting to observe.
Yeah. So what's on the horizon for your work, Tim, and what are you most excited about?
One of the things is that we're really expanding our program. We have a lot. So one of the interesting things is with all this interesting space news over the last few years, whether it's the eclipses and the James Webb Telescope, we have a lot of students that are interested in astronomy, and we actually have quite a few students that are now actually interested in participating and helping us out with this light pollution. So we actually had 3 testify at the State House, so that was a cool experience for them. But then they're also interested in helping us push the astronomy program further. And one of the areas that we see a lot of interest now is actually finding ways to share what we're doing with other people. So we're going to make a big push in the next year for more outreach. So hopefully more tours, as much as we can fit in between science operations. Because right now we have more interest than we have time to actually give tours. So if we
Yeah.
put up a notice within literally a few minutes, they'll sell out.
Wow.
So for our annual Perseid meteor shower, usually we open it up to 100, 200 people, and those will go in 10 minutes.
Wow. That's fast, actually.
So,
Wow. Yeah.
I mean, it's exciting that people are excited. We just have to find a way of like building this out so more people can experience it.
For sure. Yeah. That's amazing.
And I think we just have I think with the interest, we have a lot of opportunity to study things we didn't study before. The automation enables us to essentially observe 8, 9 hours a night and then get sleep, which is important too. So one of the consequences to traditional astronomy for the last few hundred years is you had to be up all night. And now with the automation we can live like normal people and have sort of a functional life and and analyze it during the day and get more. Right now we're getting more data than we have actually had time to analyze.
Yeah. Are you also kind of thinking in the AI direction too, to synthesize the data and kind of pull things together?
There's a lot of people that are talking about that. I don't think AI is ready in a whole host of fronts, but I think automation and scripting it is probably enough for as far as we need to go right now. That AI would have to make judgments that I'm not sure it's
Interesting.
qualified to make judgments about, it's A or B or it's in the solar system or out, or it's coming at us or it's not coming at us, or whatever decision point it would have to make. I'm not sure I trust it quite yet.
Yeah.
If it can't write an email for me yet,
Yeah.
or map something, with a simple response on the phone, I'm not sure it can make scientific discoveries quite yet, but we'll see.
Yeah. I've seen some interesting things with medical diagnoses where, where it actually synthesized information to really give a much more clear picture to the caregiver. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how AI is going to help astronomy in the future. So it'll be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think we'll get there, but I'm always cautious about handing it over. Even seeing how the automation works, which is me writing to the program, to the telescope, do this, do that in this situation. There's still human input in that, and that I make mistakes, and then it carries through. And then of course there's the other larger topic in astronomy, which is the satellite issue. So we've been very concerned. I'm seeing it in a significant percentage of our images. There's something streaking through.
Yeah.
Even something. So this was the tour I was giving with the Girl Scouts last week. Something I never experienced before until this past year or so is that even the occasional time I'm looking through an eyepiece, I'm starting to see the occasional satellite pass through
Yeah.
at dusk. And that's something I don't think I ever remember seeing before, is that they're so frequent now. You're just seeing them a lot. They're just
Yeah.
seem to be everywhere. And I'm not sure what we're going to do about that part.
Yeah, I mean, essentially, we've been filling the sky with light, wasted light, and now space junk because a lot of the satellites become defunct quite quickly. So that's why we need people like you, Tim, to kind of revive astronomy, and that hopefully that can be a gateway to get more awareness. So yeah,
I think that's many of our hopes in the community is that if more people care about it,
yeah,
then they'll be more willing to say, write to their senator and say, maybe there should be at least some regulations, because right now there's zero
yeah.
on what we do up there, because, we have all these big plans about living other places and living in space stations and the moon and the Mars, but we have to be able to get there, and we don't want to have to swim through a cloud of debris.
It's true. It's true. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show and for everything that you're doing to raise awareness around light pollution. And please come back on and tell us what, what you're seeing in terms of maybe you can come back on when actually we get the state bill passed. So fingers crossed
I
on that.
appreciate your optimism, and it's a deal. If we get this done, our team, then I will be happy to come back anytime.
Excellent.
This was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much for listening today, and I hope you'll join us on this journey. Follow us at Starving for Darkness, and you can follow me at Anatomy of Night on Instagram. If there's anyone you would like to recommend to be a guest on our show in the Boston area, you can send an email to producer@starvingfordarkness.com. We're so excited. Join us for the upcoming guests. We'll be announcing them on Instagram. Thanks so much.